My name is Francisco Reyes Cisco to everyone who knows me, and I have been running the trading post at Palo Seco Crossing for 23 years, which means I have had a front row seat to most of what has passed through this canyon country in that time. I am the son of a Mexican father and a Yavapai mother, which means I grew up in the space between two worlds and learned early that the space between worlds is where the most interesting things happen, if you have the patience to watch. I am telling this story because Gus Veard died last spring, a quiet death in his sleep, at the settlement where he had lived for 14 years, and Sana asked me to write it down. She said, "You were there from the beginning, Cisco. You know how it happened. Write it down so the children know." She said it in the way she says things, directly, without decoration, with the particular authority of a woman who has decided something and expects it to be done. I am writing it down. I want to say at the outset that I will tell it as I saw it, and that what I did not see directly I will say so. I have been a fair witness in my time, and I intend to be one now. The Palo Seco Canyon is not a forgiving piece of country. It runs northeast for about 12 miles, narrow and red-walled, with the Seco River at the bottom, a thin thread of water in the dry months, and something else entirely when the rains come off the high country to the north. The walls are 200 feet in some places, closer to 300 in others, and they funnel water the way a hand funnels sand. Fast, concentrated, and without regard for what's in the way. The Nday settlement at the canyon mouth, TSE acute K adjective IZI acute, which means something like the place where the canyon opens in their language, though that is a rough translation, and I offer it only to give you a picture, had been there longer than anyone I knew could say. 25 families, depending on the season. They were not the people the newspapers wrote about, which is to say they were people, living their lives with the same mixture of practicality and purpose that anyone brings to the business of getting through a day. I had traded with them for most of my 23 years at the crossing. I spoke enough of their language to manage, and NIHK adjective I, the elder, Sana's father, spoke enough Spanish to make up the difference. Sana was 30 years old in the summer of 1877. She was her father's eldest daughter and his most trusted person, which was evident in the way the settlement deferred to her opinions and equally evident in the way she offered them sparingly, and only when she had something worth saying. She was not what I would call warm in the way people use that word as a synonym for easy. She was something more useful. She was honest and she was fair, and she had a quality of attention that made you feel, when she was listening to you, that the matter was being taken seriously. I had known her since she was a girl. I watched her grow into the person she was at 30 with the particular appreciation of someone who had seen the process. She was not a woman the world had been kind to. The world in 1877 was not kind to her people, and she knew it, and she had developed in response a wariness about the outside world that was not hostility but was the reasonable result of experience. She trusted what she had earned the right to trust. My trading post sat at the canyon crossing, which put me between the settlement and the wider country, and I had spent 23 years being a fair dealer to everyone who came through. That was my advantage and my reputation, and I guarded it accordingly. Gus Veard came through on a Thursday in August, driving 40 head of cattle on a one-man delivery job from somewhere south of Tucson to a rancher north of the canyon. He was 36, lean, trail-worn, with the quiet economy of a man who has been doing hard outdoor work his entire adult life and no longer makes unnecessary movements. He came to my post to water his cattle and buy supplies, and he paid a fair price and said about 12 words in the transaction, which I respected. He had gray eyes and a careful way of looking at things, not suspicious, more like a man who gathers information before he acts on it, which is the best habit a person can have in difficult country. He camped at the crossing that night. He was planning to push through the canyon in the morning. The rain started at midnight. I want to tell you about the canyon in a flash flood, because you need to understand what Sana was in and what Gus veered walked into. The water comes from the high country with no warning that reaches the canyon floor in time to matter. One moment the river is 8 inches deep and clear. 15 minutes later it is 8 feet deep and the color of red clay, moving at a speed that does not accommodate standing in the way of it. The walls funnel it, and the canyon amplifies it, and the sound of it is something you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Sana had gone into the canyon that morning to check the water plants at the second bend. She had done it 100 times, knew the canyon's moods, knew the signs. What she didn't know was that the rain to the north had been coming for 3 days before it hit the high country, and when it hit all at once. She was at the second bend when the water came. She ran. She was fast and she knew the terrain, and she ran for the high ledge at the third bend, which was the standard refuge. Everyone in the settlement knew it, and she nearly made it. A debris wave came around the corner, a tangle of brush and timber that the water had collected on its way down, and it caught her at the knee and took her down and pinned her left leg against the canyon wall with a piece of timber the size of a fence rail. She was conscious. She was not going to die from the flood. The high ledge was 2 feet above her head, and the water was rising but not that fast. But she could not free the leg, and she could not reach the ledge, and the leg was broken, which she knew because she had felt it go, and because she was a practical woman who understood what broken felt like. She was there for 6 hours. Gus Veard found her at mid-morning, after the water had dropped. He had not gone into the canyon. He had heard the flood in the night and known better and waited at the crossing, which was the right call. When the water dropped to passable, he went in, not to look for anyone, just to see if the trail was clear. He came around the third bend and saw her on the ledge, her leg pinned, and he went to her. I was not there. I am telling you what Sana told me, and what she told me was this. He came into the water, it was still thigh-deep, cold, moving, and he got to the timber and he worked it free, which took time and was not easy, and when the leg came free he caught her before she could go back into the current and he carried her to dry ground. He looked at the leg. He had seen breaks before and knew what he was looking at. He did what you do. He splinted it with what he had, which was a straight piece of the debris timber and his belt and the spare rope from his saddlebag, and he did it right, and he did not ask her anything while he did it. Not her name, not what she was doing there, not whether she was grateful. When it was done, he picked her up. She was not a small woman, and the 3 miles back to TSE adjective IZI acute on rocky canyon floor is not a walk anyone would choose, and he walked. He walked 3 miles with her in his arms in wet boots on a broken canyon trail in August heat. He did not put her down once. She told me that. She said, "He did not put me down." She said it the way you say something you have thought about many times and are still thinking about. He came into TSE acute adjective IZI acute carrying her, and the settlement came out, and he put her down carefully, and he looked at the people around him. The women who came to take her, NAHK adjective I who appeared from the back of the crowd, the men who were watching him with the assessment that men give a stranger who has arrived in the middle of something they don't yet understand. And he said, in Spanish, which he knew I'd be near enough to translate, "Her leg is broken and splinted. She needs to be off it." Then he turned around and went back to the crossing. He did not wait for thanks. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask for water or food or anything at all. I watched him come back past my post and I said, "That was a good thing you did." He said she needed help. And he went to check on his cattle, which had scattered some in the night and needed gathering. He stayed at the crossing for 3 weeks. This requires some explanation. The cattle delivery was north, and the trail north went through the canyon, and the trail through the canyon was not passable for cattle for 2 weeks after a flood of that size, too much debris, too many sections undermined. It was not unusual to wait out the canyon after a big flood. The crossing had good water and grazing. He stayed. What was unusual was what he did with the 3 weeks. He did not go to the settlement. He did not ask about Sana. He went about his business, tending the cattle, maintaining his gear, coming to my post for supplies, and he was civil and quiet and unremarkable. On the fourth day he rode to the canyon mouth, not into the settlement, to the edge of it, where a clear spring came out of the rock, and he spent an hour clearing debris from the spring channel, which had gotten fouled by the flood. He left when he was done. He did not tell anyone he was going to do it. He did not mention that he had done it. I noticed because I notice most things that happen at the crossing, and I mentioned it to NAHK Adjective, I the next time he came to trade. NAHK Adjective I said nothing. He looked at me with those dark, level eyes, and he said nothing and bought his tobacco and left. On the 8th day, Gus rode to the canyon mouth again and spent a morning cutting and stacking firewood from the flood debris. There was a great deal of usable timber that the flood had deposited at the canyon mouth, and someone was going to have to deal with it, and he dealt with it. He stacked it neatly where it would be accessible, and he left. Again, he told no one. I know NAHK Adjective I saw him, because NAHK Adjective I was watching. The elder was 72 years old and had been watching the world for a long time and had a quality of attention that reminded me, in some ways, of his daughter. The same still, thorough observation, the same patience with what was being observed. He watched Gus veered from the settlement for those 3 weeks, the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. On the 15th day, Gus came to my post in the early evening and asked if I could teach him a few words of the Nday language. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without elaborate explanation. He said he figured if he was going to be in the country, he ought to know how to be respectful in the language of the people who lived there. I looked at him for a moment. Then I taught him 6 words: the greeting, the word for thank you, the word for water, the word for I mean no harm, and 2 others. He repeated them until he had them right, which took about 20 minutes, and then he thanked me and left. He used exactly one of them, the greeting, the following morning, when NAHK Adjective I came to the edge of the crossing and stood there looking at him. Gus looked up from what he was doing, which was mending a cinch strap. He said the greeting in Nday, which was approximate but recognizable. He went back to the cinch strap. NAHK Adjective I stood there for a while. Then he left. That was the entirety of their first exchange. I watched it from my post window. It took perhaps 2 minutes. Sana was on her feet by the end of the 2nd week. The break had been clean, and she was strong, and she did not stay down longer than she had to. She was walking with a stick by the 15th day, which was faster than anyone expected, and she walked to the spring the day after that, and stood there looking at the cleared channel for a long time. I know this because she told me. She said, I stood there and I looked at it and I thought about who had done it and why. She said it in the direct way she said everything. She said, I thought, a man who does a thing and doesn't tell anyone he did it is a man who did it for its own sake. She said she had been looking for that quality in people for a long time and had rarely found it. She did not go to the crossing. She was not ready to, and she did not do things before she was ready. What she did was watch. She watched from the settlement the same way her father watched, still, thorough, patient. She watched Gus veered tend his cattle and maintain his camp and come to my post and go back and do it again. She watched him not come to the settlement. She watched him not ask about her. She told me later that the not asking was what mattered most. She said, everyone who has come here wanting something has asked about me. He did not ask about me. He asked nothing. She paused. A man who carries you 3 miles and asks nothing is telling you something about himself. I agreed that he was. The canyon trail cleared on the 17th day. Gus could have left. He did not leave immediately. He came to my post that evening and asked if there was any work at the crossing that needed doing. I told him the north fence of my supply corral had 3 bad posts. He fixed them the next morning. I paid him fairly, and he took it without argument. The morning after that, the 19th day, an AHK adjective I walked to the crossing. He walked to where Gus was breaking camp. Gus had decided that morning to head north. I could see him packing, and he stood at the edge of the camp. Gus saw him and stopped what he was doing. I went to the edge of my post porch. I was close enough to hear. An AHK adjective I said, in Spanish, which he used for important things because he wanted to be certain of being understood. I have watched you for 19 days. Gus said, I know. An AHK adjective I said, you did a thing for my daughter and you asked nothing. That's right, Gus said. You cleared the spring, and you cut the wood and you asked nothing. That's right. An AHK adjective I looked at him for a long moment. He said, why? Gus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because it needed doing, and because I was here. An AHK adjective I looked at him. He had the quality that I had seen in Sana, that thorough, patient assessment that does not hurry its conclusions. He said, my daughter is not a thing to be given. You understand this? Yes, Gus said. She is not grateful to you. Gratitude is not the same as choosing. I know that, Gus said. She has seen what you are for 19 days, an AHK adjective I said. She will decide what she thinks of it. He paused. If you want to know what she thinks, you may ask her. If you do not want to know, you may go north with your cattle. Another pause. Either is acceptable to me. Gus was quiet for a long time. He looked at the canyon mouth, and then he looked at his packed camp, and then he looked at NAHK adjective I. He said, I would like to ask her. NAHK adjective I nodded once. He said, then come to the settlement this afternoon, and he walked back. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I went back inside and made coffee and thought about what I had just watched, which was an old man doing one of the hardest and most precise things a father can do, making space, exactly the right amount of space, for his daughter to decide something for herself. Gus came to the settlement that afternoon. I was not there. This is one of the parts I am telling from what Sana told me, and I will tell it as she told it. He came to the settlement, and NAHK adjective I brought him to the shade structure where Sana was working. She was weaving, she told me, because her hands needed something to do, and NAHK adjective I left them there and went somewhere else. Gus sat down in the shade. Sana did not look up from her weaving immediately. She finished the row she was on, and then she looked at him. She said in Spanish, which she spoke well, having grown up at the canyon crossing with me as a neighbor, you want to say something to me? He said, yes. She said, say it. He said, I would like to know you. Not because you owe me anything, you don't. Not because your father has given me permission, he hasn't. Because I think you are a person worth knowing, and I would like the chance to find out if I'm right. Sana looked at him. She said, that is a careful thing to say. He said, I've been thinking about how to say it for 19 days. She almost smiled. She told me about the almost smile. She said she had decided in that moment that the 19 days of thinking showed something about his character, which was that he did not rush things he wanted to get right. She said, I will tell you what I told my father. I am not grateful to you. Gratitude is not the same as choosing. He said, I know. She said, you may come back. He said, when? She said, Thursday. He nodded. He stood up. He said the end-day word for thank you, which was approximate, but she recognized it. She said he had been working on his pronunciation. He said he had been working on it for a while. He went back to the crossing. He did not go north Thursday morning. He went to the settlement. I watched the next months from my post at the crossing, which put me in the middle of it in the way that a trading post operator is always in the middle of everything, without being directly in any of it. He came on Thursdays and then sometimes on Tuesdays as well, and by November he was spending more days at the settlement than at the crossing. He learned more of the language, he came to me for it regularly, and I taught him what I could, and he supplemented it from Sana herself, who was a good teacher and a demanding one. He worked. Not the way a man works to prove himself, but the way a man works because there is work to be done and he has decided that this is where he is. He helped with the cattle the settlement kept. They ran a small herd, had for years, and he had opinions about grass and water management that NAHK adjective I found useful and received without ceremony, which was a significant thing. Sana told me once, it was December by then, cold in the canyon, that she had been watching him learn. She said he makes mistakes and he does not make excuses for them. He says, I was wrong about this. He corrects it. He does not explain the wrongness at length. She paused. I have seen many men who cannot be wrong. He is not one of them. I said, that's a rare thing. She said, yes. And then, it is the same thing as the spring. He clears the channel and he does not need to be seen doing it. I understood what she meant. The same honesty in different forms. In January of 1878, on a cold morning with the canyon walls holding the frost, Sana went to her father and told him she had decided. In AHK adjective I said, tell me. She said, I am choosing him. He said, you are certain. She said, I have been watching for 5 months. Yes. He said, tell him yourself. She went to where Gus was working on the settlement's north fence. One of the posts had gone bad in the cold, same problem he'd fixed for me, and she stood beside him. He looked at her. She said, I have decided. He said, what have you decided? She said, I am choosing you, if you want to be chosen. He set down his tools. He said, yes, I want to be chosen. She said, then you should know some things. She told him directly, as she told everything, what it would mean. What it would not mean. That she was not going to leave this place. That he would be the one who came to this world, not the other way, and that if he came fully and without one foot elsewhere. That her father's respect had to be maintained not as a condition but as a fact, because it was her father and that was how it was. Gus listened to all of it. Then he said, I understand all of that. I want you to know something too, he said. I've been in a lot of country. I've met a lot of people. I have never met anyone like you and I don't expect to again. I'm not going to waste that. She said, all right. And then, after a pause, the fence post needs setting before the ground freezes harder. He picked up his tools and set the post. They were joined in the way of her people. I will not describe it beyond saying that it was done properly and with NAHK adjective I presiding and the settlement witnessing, and that Gus stood in that ceremony with the same steady attention he brought to everything. Present, unhurried, meaning what he was doing. I was there. I was invited, which I understood to be a significant gesture, and I attended with the respect it deserved. He moved to the settlement fully. He gave up the cattle driving work, which he had been doing alone, and which had no particular claim on him beyond habit. He built a structure at the settlement's edge, with help, not alone, which was also significant, and he ran it as a secondary trading point that complemented my post rather than competing with it, which was a practical arrangement we worked out together and which benefited both of us. NAHK adjective I lived another 8 years. In those 8 years, he and Gus had a relationship that I watched carefully because it was the most interesting thing I had a front row seat to in a long career of watching interesting things. It was not easy, 2 men from different worlds with different habits and different ways of knowing what was right, working out the same patch of ground together. It was honest. Gus made mistakes, cultural ones, practical ones, the kinds that come from not having grown up inside a set of understandings, and he acknowledged them and corrected them, and did not explain himself at length. NAHK adjective I corrected him directly when correction was needed, and praised him seldom and watched him carefully always. and what I saw growing between them over 8 years was something that I think deserved the word respect in both directions, which is the only direction that word means anything. When NIHK adjective I died, Gus sat with the family in the way that was right. He did not need to be told how. He had learned. Sana and Gus had 14 years together. I was there for all of them, in the way that a trading post operator is present, adjacent, observing, making myself useful where I could. I want to tell you what those 14 years looked like, because I think it is the point. They were not a couple who made a show of themselves. Sana was not a woman given to display, and Gus was not a man given to it. And together they were two private people sharing a life with a directness and an economy that I found admirable. They disagreed about cattle management and trade practices, and about the children, 3 of them, who grew up in the space between their parents' worlds the way I had grown up in the space between mine. The disagreements were conducted plainly and resolved practically, and I never once saw either of them try to win an argument at the expense of the other's dignity. The children, 2 daughters and a son, grew up speaking Nday and Spanish and enough English for trading, and grew up knowing who they were in a way that I have not always seen in children of mixed worlds, which I attribute to both their parents having been clear about who they were before they ever met. Gus died last spring. He had been slowing for 2 years, something in his chest, the way it goes with men who have spent 30 years in hard outdoor work, and he died in the settlement where he had lived for 14 years, in the structure he had built at the settlement's edge, with Sana beside him and their children there, and Cisco raised me, sitting outside the door because I had been asked to come and I came. He died at night, quiet, the kind of death that fits the life. In the morning, Sana came out and sat beside me on the step. She said, "Write it down, Cisco." I said, "I will." She said, "Write it the way it happened, not the way people expect it to have happened." I said, "How do you mean?" She said, "People expect it to be about the flood and the carrying. They will think that is the story." She looked at the canyon. The carrying was one morning, the rest was everything else. Write the everything else. I want to do what she asked, which means I want to end with the thing that I watched for 15 years, and that I think is the point. Gus Veard was not a complicated man. He was a man with a code which is different from a complicated man, simpler in some ways and harder in others. The code was, do what needs doing, don't make more of it than it is, don't ask for what you haven't earned. He carried Sana 3 miles because she needed carrying. He cleared the spring because the spring needed clearing. He cut the wood because the wood needed cutting. He learned the language because the people who spoke it deserved to be spoken to in their own tongue. He came to the settlement on Thursdays and then on Tuesdays and then most days because that was where he had decided to be, and he did not go elsewhere because he had no reason to. He did not do any of it to earn her. I think that is the thing Sana understood in those 5 months of watching. And I think it is the thing NIHK adjective I understood in his 19 days. And I think it is the thing that made what happened between them what it was rather than what it might otherwise have been. The carrying was a morning, the rest was a life. He carried her 3 miles through the desert and asked nothing, and her father watched what that meant in practice for 5 months, and then he said, "Now my daughter chooses," and she chose. And they built 14 years of something honest at the mouth of a canyon in the desert, and their children grew up knowing who they were. And that is the whole of the story, and it does not need more than what it is. I am Cisco Reyes, and I was there.